All right. Welcome back to the Press Rec Podcast. I'm Ryan. This is Will. And today we wanted to talk a little bit about interviews and conducting interviews, how to write good interview questions, what makes a good interview, and how to get the best stuff when you sit down with somebody. A lot of our content involves interviewing people who we've maybe never met in person or we've only spoken to on the phone very briefly. So I kind of wanted to start with like high level, what makes an interview good?
I think first of all, before you can do anything, you have to know who your subject is and what they're all about, right? Before you can even write questions and really like understand what you're doing, you really just need to know who you're interviewing. Are you interviewing a PhD of neuroscience, or are you interviewing a farmer? There's two very different topics, or very different subjects, and you would want to aim your topics accordingly. So I'd say high level, you need to have a good understanding of who you're interviewing, what industry they're in, or what they're talking about. That can kind of like let your brain wander a little bit on how you craft your questions.
But you want to make it about the person, right? And keep it personal. I like to warm them up by getting them to talk about themselves. And they're the expert in them, right?
Yeah.
So ask them about what they're passionate about. What did they do this weekend? What did they eat for breakfast? That's one of our favorites for like sound check and warming up. Is, this morning I had a bagel. Or we interviewed that guy in North Dakota that said he eats peanut butter toast every day. And we had this like meme in the office where we played that soundbite 1,000 times because he said it's super funny.
Yeah.
But you get some good stuff that way, and it kind of breaks the tension in the room and gets people like out of the lights and out of their head and out of the cameras and kind of into the conversation.
Yep.
Which I think is really important.
That's the hardest step sometimes, is just getting someone to feel comfortable on camera, kind of forget the lights and cameras are there and just like kind of just get lost in the conversation. If you can achieve that by the end of your interview, you should have a good interview most of the time.
What's the first thing that we always say to somebody when they sit down in the chair and we start rolling?
We always usually, like you said, we get them loosened up with the audio sound check. What'd you eat for breakfast? And then we usually get them to like say and spell their name for the editor. A lot of times, we send footage out to a post house that's not in-house with us, and the editor needs to know who they're looking at before they get going.
Yep. It's also a good way for like last second checks. I like, say and spell your first and last name better than count to 10 for me, because 10 counting down or counting up feels like final, like I'm counting to the end or I'm counting to the beginning. There's a little more pressure associated with that, but everybody can spell their name, even if it's really complicated. They know how to spell it because they've been doing it their whole lives. Yeah. So it's easy, it's second nature, it loosens them up, and it kind of, again, helps sort of break some of that tension. And I think a lot of the first 10, 15 minutes of an interview is breaking that tension, getting them out of their own heads and getting them comfortable so that the conversation can kind of flow. You and I both have done hundreds, thousands of interviews on camera with people over the years, and we both do them a little bit differently. And I have notes about how I like to do interviews, and I know we want to talk about some of how you like to do stuff, but I think one of the biggest things that sticks out to me that's a differentiator between me and you is how we track the questions and what we use. So why don't you start and talk about how you like to have your questions prepared and how you use them to conduct the interview?
Yeah, sure. It's probably going to tell my age pretty quickly, but I like, things printed out on paper, right? A lot of people just want to look at screens all day, and that's fine. But for me, I don't like being connected to any kind of devices when I'm doing interviews. I like just having a piece of paper that I can look at. I can write my notes on it. I know you could do a phone and do the same thing, but for me, my brain, I like having a piece of paper. That way the subject knows that I'm not like checking my email on my phone or scrolling on social media. I just feel like I can have a stronger conversation, and I can take my notes without being super distracting. And a lot of times, I think people that are new to doing interviews they're too scared to go off script too much, and they want to just go straight down a list of questions. And I like writing my notes to, like, if I think of something while they're talking, I try to scribble down a quick word or two to remind myself to ask them when it's appropriate time. Maybe like an off the cuff question or something like a question that came out of one of their other answers, something that I could follow up on. I think a mistake people that are new to interviewing do is they just want to fly through their list of questions to be done. They don't really listen and engage and understand what the person's saying back to them so you can ask them a follow-up question. I think that's the biggest missed opportunity for people that are new to this, is that they need to just stay engaged in a conversation and not just wait for them to stop talking so you can ask
Yeah.
your next question, right?
That's such a rookie move, right? And I feel like we have seen that on sets that we've been on with producers who we've worked with throughout the years, where maybe they're so married to that list of questions, and they could have written it in the perfect order for how they thought the conversation was going to go in their head. But as soon as somebody starts to take a turn, your questions might then be in the wrong order for that conversation, and it kind of breaks the flow. It breaks that concentration barrier with the person, and it can really derail the thought process of somebody for what they're in the middle of. You said that you like paper notes, and I really like that you see the digital disconnect when someone is using a phone. And it's funny because every time I do it, I try and purposefully put everything on a phone. And I try and keep like my thumb on my screen and constantly scroll so that my phone doesn't go to sleep. I don't have to unlock it and like actively stare at my phone. But when I write questions, I write very, very few questions. I think comparatively, I lean towards like 5, maybe sometimes 10 questions, very few. And I like to really just listen and tune into the person and just let the conversation go where it may. And really get to know them better, try and dive into the deeper aspects of what it is that we're talking about there and why they feel strongly about certain topics or don't about others. And I feel like sometimes overwriting an interview is kind of a rookie mistake too. Like you could have 45 questions, but you're trying so hard to get to all of them because you thought of them ahead of time. You might be able to think of better ones on the spot and in the moment that are more relevant to the video that you're making or the person that you're talking to. Even if you've done all your homework and all of your pre-production and all of your pre-interviews, there's still things that you miss. Mm-hmm. And you have to leave room for the unexpected in moments like that. Question for you, I'm curious, like how frequently during an interview would you say that you're actively taking notes? Like you as the person asking the questions, are you looking down, stopping, and writing anything?
I'd say rarely. Mm-hmm. It's really only if there's something that's just a sparked topic or something that just gave me an idea, like I better write this down or I'm going to forget to ask.
Yeah.
It's really kind of the panic mode. Because if you're writing too much, you're kind of taking your attention away from the subject, and I think that's a mistake. If they see you just writing half the time and you're not engaged, locking eye contact, making, smiling back at the people, right? You want to project the emotion you want to get back from these folks. So I think if you're just staring at either a screen or a piece of paper and you're not engaged, your interview will suffer.
Yeah.
Going back to the writing too many questions, I think that kind of is a rookie mistake. But I also remember me being like a young filmmaker and like, man, I better have like a lot of ammunition because if this person sucks at being on camera, I need a lot of questions. Or if I'm just getting one or really bad 1 or 2 word responses, I need to have a lot of ammunition here. So, and I think before you really know how many questions you write, you really need to know like what kind of piece you're making. Is it a 2-minute recap video or is it a 45-minute sit down talking head video? Those look very different. True. You would need to have a lot of questions if it's like a 45-minute or even a feature length doc. That's a lot different too, right? Mm-hmm. So I think understanding what you're making is like the first step before you can even think about writing questions. How long is the piece you're making? What are you making? Who's the subject? All that before you even start writing questions.
Yeah, and that's a great piece of advice that I didn't take in my notes, but you bring up a good point. Like sometimes I'm maybe not even writing questions, but I'm writing like the themes or topics. Like the overarching topics that I know that I want to get to. And that's enough at a quick glance to get me back on track without like deeply looking and reading and comprehending. I can just see a word or a phrase and it kind of gets me back into where I need to be without totally disengaging the person. Something I did write a lot about that you already touched on is mirroring to them what you want them to do back to you. This is something that I do a lot of and I'm very conscious of during an interview is if I want them to smile, I'll smile at them and nod. If maybe I notice that they have like a hair or something, I may go like this a couple times on my own face to see if they'll feel it, notice it, and mirror it back. The same thing can kind of go the other way. If you're new to this or you're unsure of yourself or this is the first or fifth interview that you've ever done and you're really tense and tight and not open and having a good conversation, they'll feel that energy and that will be reflected back to you. So you really have to be careful and confident in your ability to ask good questions, but really it's your ability to have a conversation with somebody that makes an interview good or powerful.
100%. Yeah, it's the questions are almost more important than the answers sometimes, right? To get you're trying to tell a story here. You're a storyteller, right? When you're doing these interviews, and you really want to pull out the moments that matter. It's hard to we're all fishing for sound bites here, but sometimes it's hard to pull out the right sound bite. Sometimes you get a jumbled mess that's hard to articulate back or to cut it up and post and make it an articulate piece. But we've piecemealed all kinds of word vomit together to make it a cohesive sentence. We've done that a lot.
Yeah.
So what do you do when you get somebody and they're super nervous and they're not really giving you the answers you're looking for? What would you do as an interviewer?
There's a couple different techniques and school of thought to this. Like some people have like a code word that they use with their crew that isn't cut the cameras, but it alludes to the viewer that we're taking a break, right? For instance, when we start recording something, we might say camera's rolling. And then the person who's doing the interview might say, all right, guys, let's take a break for a minute. You can go ahead. But without saying cut the cameras or cut the clip or let's stop, something that would indicate, yes, I'm going to hit the button and stop rolling. And they think that we've taken a break and maybe we can have a conversation still in the same seat without screwing up the shot. Or we've done this before where somebody else comes in and not everybody knows that we're recording until after. So that's one way. We watched a master's class with, I think it was Ken Burns, right, who gave us that idea for the code phrase to break. And we've used that a couple times. That's not our favorite technique. I think what I like to do is try and get them back to talking about themselves or thinking about themselves or things that they love. So I'll ask them a question like, what's your favorite hobby? Tell me more about that. What's your favorite thing about your job? Tell me about the things that you love, because that can kind of break some of the tension and get somebody a little bit more comfortable.
Exactly.
You could talk all day long about riding a bike, if you love riding a bike. You just got to get there.
Yeah, that's key. If you're talking about something that's especially if it's something super serious or complex, you want to break the tension with something fun, something that they can let their guard back down and talk about, like you said, talk about themselves, talk about their kids, talk about their pets. Doesn't matter. Just get them talking again. Yep. Get them to talk without the nervous jitter in their voice to where they can just hold a conversation again, and then ease back into the questions. Yeah. That would be my suggestion as well.
What are some of your favorite questions that we try and ask most, if not everybody?
Yeah, I think that what's your favorite part about your job is always a home run, no matter what you do. And our company, Press Record, we work in multiple vertical industries. Some days we're filming sports, some days we're filming education, some days we're in a hospital. We're all over the map. But everybody has a favorite part of their job, or they hate their job, and you can get them to talk about that too. So what's your favorite thing about your job question just circles back to opening up, and you want people to forget, even if it's for 5 seconds, that they're not on camera and just can speak freely. That's the whole goal of an interview, is to get someone to speak freely and trust you, right? They got all these lights and cameras on them. They probably never sat under the lights and cameras, and they're nervous. They're very self-conscious about how they look, how they sound. So you want to get them talking again. So what's your favorite thing about your job? Usually you can, without having to think too hard, you know what your favorite thing is about your job, and you can hopefully get that out in one cohesive soundbite without too much trouble.
Yeah.
That's the only one's coming to mind right now, but I know we have a lot of
I like to ask, I always say the mushy questions are the ones that are a little more abstract. What's something that you've done recently that you're very proud of? That could be anything. They could say something about taking their kid to a soccer game. They could say, I achieved the biggest milestone in my career. And you might just not have known that ahead of that conversation, right? It could give you a way to go. There's all sorts of different tricks for this. I know the what's your favorite job one is great. What makes your business great? What's something that you're proud of? Tell me about a big win recently, something that's, slanted positively. And again, gets them talking about themselves and kind of helps them get into more of a flow. And it could lead somewhere that the conversation would not have gone otherwise. To the other side of that, there's a sensitivity here when people do get emotional, right? We've done interviews before where we've sat down with somebody and we said, tell me about yourself. And they talk for 25 minutes and they give us their whole life story, and then they start to sob. And it's okay, let's take a step back and take this piece by piece. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about the good stuff, and then we'll slowly work our way back into the really heavy stuff. Men in particular on camera, when they get emotional, they're ready to get up, leave the room, break kind of the moment. And as the person sitting in the interview chair, I know you and I both have been in situations where that's been pretty tough. recently with a job that we were on that happened where, he was trying really hard to keep his composure and not break, but we're not trying to encourage them to be uncomfortable, but we want to capture the real emotion too. So you kind of have to be quiet and let them have their moment.
It's a tricky balance. I think I've learned in the past when I'm interviewing someone and they get emotional, I'm too quick to jump on it like, oh, it's okay. But sometimes you just have to let it breathe and let them be uncomfortable and upset for a few seconds before you say anything.
Yeah.
Because you might step over. They may have been able to give you gold just then, but you were jumping in too early. So there's a tricky balance to knowing when is the time to try to soothe someone if they're miserable or they're having a tough time. But I kind of like, you kind of just need to let them work it out on their own sometimes and just be quiet.
It's tough.
Yeah, and the other kind of like psychology trick is the longer you go without saying something, they feel like they should say something, right? That whole trick too, that little Jedi mind trick where the interviewer should just shut up and let the person talk. And if there's like awkward silence for 30 seconds, the person feels like they need to say something.
It totally works.
Yeah.
It totally works. And I can only think of one time where somebody's gotten up out of my chair when I've been doing an interview, and it was a really hard subject for that person. And he made it really clear, I need a break. I'm out. And he stood up and he came back 5 to 10 minutes later, and he didn't sit down and say, F you or don't go there. We got right back into it. He just needed a minute to kind of collect himself, and we were talking about some stuff that was really heavy.
Yeah.
And I think too about Kim Smith, the film that we did for Driven, when she got really emotional talking about her daughter and having a daughter late in life with autism, and she got very emotional, and we did the trick where we just sat back and didn't say anything and let it happen. And she went through her moment and she composed herself, and then she kept going with her thought. And some of the sound bites are some of the most powerful things that we can capture, and they're used time and time and time again, but it really encapsulates that raw emotion, and it really helps like share that story in an authentic way, in an authentic way, right? It shows really what they were feeling.
For sure.
Yeah.
And that's when you get pretty deep into the interview. By that point, when you're really pulling those kinds of emotion outs and you're that deep, you're probably like 30 to 45 minutes into your interview. If it's like an hour-long interview, which is traditionally about how long we record a lot of the interviews we do. And another thing that we've kind of learned over time is I feel like the person is the most warmed up the last 15 minutes is when they're giving you all the gold. And what you want to remember is, and a lot of times when I say I'm writing down notes, it's like, I didn't like the way they introduced themselves. I'm going to ask them that at the very end, once they're all warmed up and going, reintroduce yourself. And then you're going to usually get, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a much better soundbite when the person's like comfortable, energized, trusting you, comfortable. You'll get your best soundbite then at the end, I think. So a lot of times when I'm taking notes, it's like circle back to this, circle back to that, circle back to that. Sometimes someone's just not ready, or they're not in the right mindset, or their brain isn't going at the right speed yet to articulate what they need to say.
One of the best tricks that I learned in school, probably one of the biggest things that I took from my education, my background in education was in journalism, so I took a lot of classes around how to conduct interviews, how to talk to people, but it was more about like using sources to get information. What we do is a little different. And one of the things that they taught me in journalism school was always ask at the end, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to talk about? And sometimes they'll say, no, I'm good. You asked me everything. But 9 times out of 10, they give you something really, really thoughtful and powerful and emotional that you wouldn't have thought of, or information that you didn't think to dive in on because they're kind of in the flow and thinking in the train of thought that you've already led them down. They might hit on something that you weren't expecting. And sometimes we get our best stuff from a question that's not really a question.
Right. You're totally right. That is like one of the best tricks is that tell me, is there something I didn't ask you that you want to tell us about? That is so open-ended. And again, person's usually pretty warmed up by the end that they might be able to tell you something that you would have had no idea about to even ask, right? Something just random, something interesting that you wouldn't have even known. So that is a very valuable question to follow up with at the end. We do that pretty much almost every interview we do.
Yep. Another thing that I like to do, and this is the last thing I have in my notes here, is about field interviews and field questions. I like to try and save some of those questions for in the moment, kind of on the fly sort of things. And That's a lot harder because especially like as camera operators and directors, you're kind of in the moment with them too, and it's hard to think about these things. But if you can save a handful of questions for in the moment stuff, what's your favorite part about your job? What's your favorite part about this piece of equipment, this thing that you're using, this thing that you do? Tell me about a big win. Some of these easier concepts to remember in the moment while they're using the thing, they're doing the tricks, they're in the moment. You can get some really, really good stuff that just aids to the interview and the overall piece. I think a lot of production companies and filmmakers, they lean like 100% into the sit-down interview, and they're missing opportunity to capture stuff that's a little bit more raw and in the moment, just because like from a production standpoint, it might not be perfect, sound perfect, look perfect, be lit perfect. Sometimes it's better when it's real.
100%. Yeah. And it's always nice. It always makes the video feels more multi-dimensional when you have like interview and then you can throw to like in the field a soundbite that matches up nice with an interview topic. I love that. A lot of people do that. We've kind of learned what works good for us. And you're right. We don't always, I wouldn't necessarily say we save questions because I do like asking those same questions during the sit down interview, but I always try to flag it or star it and say, I'm going to ask that when he's doing X or whatever this person's all about. So yeah, that's a really good trick. And I think that just opens up more opportunities in post to kind of cut creative ways to cut the storyline, cut more B-roll of live action back into this piece rather than, you're not leaning on the talking head for the whole narrative, the whole part of the story, right?
Mm-hmm. What tips, if you have any, for somebody who's maybe sitting down to write interview questions? Maybe they're like a marketing professional and they're not actually going to conduct the interview, but they're going to put together some kind of an outline to talk about a topic. High level, I would say like you want to focus on who they are, what it is that they do, how they relate to your brand or initiative, and then kind of have that as a framework to sort of guide your questions. But is there anything there that like maybe you would add as some tips for somebody?
My biggest tip is you need practice. If you've never interviewed someone, practice. Write your questions of what you think would be good, and then interview your brother, your mom, your dog, whoever, doesn't matter. Just talk, ask the questions. You should record yourself asking the questions too, so you can maybe self-correct any mistakes, or you can just be aware of how you looked and how you're projecting energy. Maybe you realize that you're frowning the whole time you're asking questions and you don't want to do that. You want to smile, you want to engage, you want to make eye contact. So you just need practice. That is the biggest tip I can give, is just get in front of the camera, get someone else in front of the camera, and record a conversation and play it back. Learn from your mistakes. Be self-aware of what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, what you can improve on before you really get somebody in the hot seat.
I agree. And interviews and real stories are what drive our films and really help us craft that narrative. And so it's really important that those questions are thoughtful and fleshed out, and that you're not just going in blind. There is a little bit of work up front that everybody needs to do. The production agency or the filmmaker and the client, and sometimes even the person who's being interviewed. It's a collaborative effort. It doesn't all just land on one person. So it maybe somebody watching this has been tasked with writing questions for the first time and they stumble across this video. I'd say, like, don't be afraid to lean back on the people in your circle to help you make something really special.
Yeah. The more time you put into pre-production and kind of trying to craft this story ahead of time and writing thoughtful questions, I think the better outcome you're going to get. And, again, it does depend on the person you're interviewing. If they're super stiff and they can't ever get loosened up, you're probably going to have a rough interview. And that you kind of need to suffer through some of those until you get some good ones, right? Not every interview is going to be a home run for you. You're going to get some where you're excited about going into it, and then you quickly realize this person is a snoozer, or no one's going to watch this. And that's an awful feeling. We've all done interviews where we're like, this person just doesn't have an interesting story, but I'm going to try my best to pull it out of them. So going through some of those struggles and having bad interviews sometimes, it feels horrible, but you kind of need to get that experience under your belt to understand how to conduct good interviews and pull out really great sound bites out of people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, we've really shot some stinkers over the years, right? Ones where you really think you're going to get something special, and maybe they're camera shy, or they just fall flat, or their story's not as deep as you thought it was. And you've got to be quick on your feet and confident in your ability to adapt in situations like that, to be able to kind of save something that it might be going downhill fast. And to the same token, if somebody's talking way too much, they're giving you way more information than you need, while you're trying to craft a conversation with somebody, there's a degree of like, there's a certain point where you kind of have to be rude and step over somebody and say like, okay, I think I have what I need here. I'm going to start talking about something else. You wouldn't do that in a normal conversation.
Right.
You just sit there and take it, even if it's boring you to death. Everybody's done that.
For sure.
So I hope that these tips that we've learned throughout the years help some of you out there who are writing interview questions or conducting interviews for the first time. If you'd like to see more of our stuff, check us out at pressrecordmedia.com and at pressrecordmedia on YouTube. We'll see you guys in the next podcast.
We will continue to keep you informed as this story unfolds. That's hard to be instead, not you. Indeed, that are